Hello, friends and family, and welcome back to episode 5 of 10 about Alta River's Gilbert Thornton and her family. Last episode, I shared how there were some things about Caroline Alice's death announcement that didn't sit right with me. This episode, we'll learn about the high-stakes legal lawsuit that she and her husband Samuel were involved in at the time of her death, and particularly what led to Alta Rivers and her siblings, Robert, Martha, Flora, Floyd, Fred, and Bertha, to becoming half orphans. I've got lots of content to share, so let's get straight into it. Picking up where we left off in episode 4, this is titled The Unfortunate Samuel Gilbert. Based on the pardon request submitted to Indiana Governors Conrad Baker, written by Samuel's prosecuting attorney, signed by jury members and many other community members. Before we get started, here's a quick glance at Samuel Gilbert's family tree. Samuel Gilbert, who would be one of my second great-grandfathers, was born to Elijah and Mary Ann Ridgway, and Elijah's father was Amos Gilbert Sr., you see at the top left there. Many online trees mistakenly name Elijah's mother as a woman named Sarah Magruder, but Sarah and Amos did not marry until 1810, and they were in different places at the time Elijah and Amity were born. Amos and the mother of his first 2 children just seemed to be untraceable before he arrived in Indiana. I've got some theories about that, but that will require a whole different level of research for another time. The point for now is that Elijah and Amity were clearly treated differently and separately from Amos's children with Sarah in wills, in education and literacy, and in finances. Samuel's grandfather, Amos Gilbert Sr., was a tavern owner in Switzerland County. This article quotes a traveler passing through recommending Amos's tavern, saying, quote, that should any friends have occasion to pass through, to at least take a glass of hard cider with them. Mr. Gilbert is a clever old gentleman and deserves much at the hands of his Whig friends. Amos and some of his sons are documented as part of the Whig Party and active abolitionists. This is the 1950 census for Amos's son, Elijah. Elijah was the only one of his siblings who could not read or write according to the 1850 and 1860 census. That's what those 2 tick marks in the second to last column are for. We see that Elijah was a farmer and had about $400 in property, not necessarily real estate, but total property. Here is his family again in the 1860 census. Notice that there is no value for him in the real estate column, center to the right of the occupation column. Based on the properties around him, it appears that he and his family worked on the farms of the Liebrooks, who were from Virginia and now living and farming in Indiana. The value of their farms ranged between $1,000 and $4,000. We won't get into all of Samuel's siblings, but here are 2 of them, Amos and Joseph. On census records, they are both listed as farmers. In early census records, they have little value, but by later records, they seem to have accumulated a little bit more wealth, both owning small farms of their own valued between $300 and $800. And here we have Samuel Gilbert with Caroline, 1870, ages 26 and 18 years old, respectively. Their real estate value is $300 and personal estate $225. Not as much as their neighbor here, but not bad for a 26-year-old just pardoned by Governor Conrad Baker. Unfortunately for Samuel and Caroline, this $300 in real estate becomes hotly contested in a court case that went all the way up to Indiana's state Supreme Court. We'll get into that now, starting with where the land came from. The land was actually purchased by Caroline's mother, Eliza. This is a copy of the transaction, and it says in summary that John and Elizabeth Bakes convey a warranty to Eliza and Ridgway of Switzerland County in the sum of $350 on October 4th, 1869. Then in 1872, Eliza gifts the land to Caroline, and you see here it says the value $200. Eliza gives Caroline the deed. Caroline is the grantee, not Samuel. What becomes the issue is that the very next day, Samuel, without Caroline present, signs a new note with John Bakes. So the land was originally sold for $350. Eliza paid $100 and then gave another note for $50, leaving $200 on the lien. She signs the deed over to Caroline, and the next day, Samuel signs a note for $267 for the land and I think the records say a colt with John Bakes. Moving on here, when searching for Alta Rivers in the Indiana archives, I learned that Samuel and Caroline Alice were involved in a heated land dispute, which I've already set up the foundation for, with the same John Bakes, a prominent business owner from Switzerland County. You'll see here that one of the searches for John Bakes comes up as John Baker, but that was a mistake. Bakes is the correct name. Similarly, Caroline and Alice are used interchangeably throughout the court documents, but they are undoubtedly referring to Caroline Alice Babb Gilbert. Here are a few screenshots from court documents. And like I said, Caroline and Alice are used interchangeably. Caroline was her first name and the name commonly found on official documents, including the census records. But Alice was the name that she seemed to go by and the name that was given on Flora and Alta's death certificate. So John Bakes sues Samuel and Caroline in 1881, which is 12 years after the transaction with Eliza and 9 years after Eliza transferred the deed to Caroline. The short of the story is that John Bakes said he was never paid in full. Eliza said she did pay, and Caroline and Samuel had a separate lien with John Bakes. Complicating matters is that Samuel's attorney forges Caroline's signature. According to Samuel's testimony, quote, I signed the note and mortgage sued on at Esquire Patterson's, and he signed my wife's name to it and wrote and signed the acknowledgement. I told him to, and he said, man and wife are one, and what the man does, the wife does. I had no conversation with my wife about it before I signed the note and mortgage. At the trial, 2 attorneys testified that they had worked with this attorney that forged Caroline's name. He must have passed away. And those 2 attorneys affirmed that it was the forger attorney's signature. So again, Caroline is technically the property owner, but she was not present when the new lien was signed and an attorney forged her name. According to the trial, she knew nothing about this for 9 years until the suit came up. Before we get into more testimony, let's pause to learn a little bit about John Bakes. John Bakes Sr. was one of the original settlers in Switzerland County. According to this biography from the History of Switzerland County, his parents settled there in 1813. In the 1870 census, John Bakes reported $50,000 in real estate value and $4,000 in personal estate value. In 1880, at the age of 72, he was a widower and had 2 servants living with him, which means he would have been 73 when he sued Caroline, Alice, and Samuel, and 79 by the time the suit is definitively decided. Now, here is Eliza's testimony. She says that she paid $100 in cash to John Bakes at the time of the purchase. She gave a second note worth $50. She gave 33 bushels of rye worth $1 a bushel, and she says that she gave 2 cows worth $40 to $45. I've got many direct quotes from Eliza herself, my 3rd great-grandmother in my mitochondrial line. Here are some of the quotes from her testimony. I know Mr. Bakes got the mare. I sold him the cows at the time Alice was talking about getting the land. Samuel Gilbert took the cows to him. I saw them afterwards at Mr. Bakes' pasture. I sold to him when he was standing on a limb in a peach tree. He was throwing down peaches. No one was present but my little boy. I thought I had paid him before he took Samuel Gilbert's note for the land. He said to me that he had taken Samuel Gilbert's note for the balance, and I said, good God, I thought I had paid enough to pay several such claims. I asked if we were even, and he said yes. Lastly, she testified, there was no arrangement between my daughter and myself for her to pay me anything for the land. I gave it to her. It was my father's money, and I had the right to give it to her. I had a right to give it to whom I pleased. My daddy gave it to me. Of course, John Bakes had a different version. He said that he received the $100, makes no mention of the $50 note. He said that he paid money for the mare and that he traded the young calves for dry cows. And he said that he did not get any rye on the notes or on the land. Some quotes from his testimony. I let Samuel Gilbert have money several times after his wife got the land. He was very poor, and I tried to encourage him. He may have brought me rye for the money I let him have, but I did not get it on the land or notes. Miss Ridgway did not say I thought I had paid enough to pay several such claims. I talked with Alice Gilbert several times about paying the notes owed. She told me she would pay it until the last time. She then told me she was a minor when she signed the mortgage and to foreclose it if I wished. As if all of this wasn't messy enough, it turns out that Caroline Alice was under 21 years old and considered a minor when Samuel's attorney forged her signature. Remember in episode 4, I called attention to the variations in the census records and guessed her to be born in 1853. Well, it turns out that we get to learn directly from Eliza when Caroline Alice was born. She says, quote, I am Alice Gilbert's mother. She was born August 11th, 1852. I was married November 6, 1851. Alice married in February or January of 1868. Alice was 13 or 14 years old when she married. Alice being underage becomes a critical factor in the trial. Her attorneys arguing that even if man and wife are one, Eliza gifted the land to Caroline, not Samuel, and Caroline was not of legal age to sign contracts. Samuel, her aunt, and her uncle, and Caroline herself had to testify about her age. Now we get to hear from Caroline in her own words. She says, I am Caroline A. Gilbert, one of the defendants in this action. I did not sign or acknowledge the mortgage. I was not at Esquire Patterson's. Mr. Bakes came to me and asked me to pay for the land. I said, I don't owe you anything. If Sam owes you anything, go to him and settle. He said he would foreclose the mortgage. I said, if you have one, foreclose it. Here's a screenshot of a piece of the record. It says, quote, I never heard of it until a few days before the suit was brought. Caroline A. Gilbert. And notice here that the X between A for Alice and Gilbert, I believe that exact X to be her signature. You see it says her X mark, if you can read a little bit above and below it. So who wins? Caroline Alice and Samuel, because they were both in the original suit, but unfortunately the win doesn't last for long. John Bakes appealed for a new trial in Switzerland County and was denied, but then he escalated the case. This document dated 1884 says, quote, John Bakes swears that he is plaintiff in the above entitled cause, that he cannot have a fair and impartial trial in the entitled cause before the Honorable James Y. Allison, judge of said court, before whom he said cause is party, which bias and prejudices exist against plaintiff and has cause of action as plaintiff really believes. So John Bakes, a prominent settler of Switzerland County, who was a wealthy businessman and politically connected, claimed that he could not get a fair trial in Switzerland County. Basically, he said that there is no proof that the family paid him what he was owed. The court agreed and said that the lower court erred by not granting his appeal for a retrial. Caroline appealed the upper court's decision, but it lost. Here's a newspaper clipping announcing the Supreme Court outcome. But look at the date in the top right corner. This article is from June 3rd, 1886. The Supreme Court decision came 2.5 months after Caroline Alice died. Here's that newspaper announcement again. I had no idea when I first saw this article all the backstory as to why it fell off. I just knew that it fell off. Not only is there no mention that she recently had a baby, there is no mention that she had a baby while dealing with the stress of potentially losing her home. The mention of her being 37 feels intentional to me. These people were in a small town, and there is nothing that anyone could say to convince me that everybody didn't know about this trial and how ultimately it came down to her age. Samuel is in the clear from my initial suspicions. I can't see how he would have benefited from Caroline Alice's death. And I'm not going as far to say as someone did something intentionally to harm her. But it would not at all surprise me if Dr. Shade, who was the doctor that signed her death certificate, also a Freemason, by the way, or someone else wasn't planning to use her death to their advantage. I'm not certain what happened after this court case was decided. I assume that Samuel had to surrender the home and the 6 acres that was in dispute. And I wonder if this is the point that Samuel lost custody of his children and they had to be separated, making them half orphans, as Alta Rivers has been described to us by her family. If you're wondering what happened to Mr. Bakes, he lived 10 more years. In March of 1913, his heirs sold his 130 acres occupied by his son-in-law, Mr. Protzman. The land was described as, quote, one of the most desirable pieces of real estate on Parks Ridge. Remember that he had $50,000 in real estate, so I assume that other parts of his land were distributed shortly after his death. It might be interesting to find his will. Lastly, I'll leave you with one more little nugget I learned about John Bakes from this 1876 article, which was 5 years before he brought suit against Samuel and Caroline. This article is not about him, but a good chunk of it references him. Basically, in an article published previously to this one, someone accused Judge Berkshire to playing favoritism to certain attorneys. The author was defending Judge Berkshire ahead of an election, saying that people were slandering him. Highlighted in yellow is the part of the case that will talk about John Bakes. It says, how Berkshire guards the interest of orphan children. Here the author references the original article published attacking Judge Berkshire for corruption. It says it doesn't give names, but we should assume that the accusation was that Judge Berkshire favored attorneys Carter and Johnson. Carter and Johnson were attorneys for several cases, including a case named Nanny B. Bakes versus Hiram H. and John Bakes. Later in the article, it says, quote, they say the judge from his seat on the bench told the attorneys that if they would file a demurrer for John Bakes, he would sustain it, and that John Bakes went out of the case without merit. Then the author, who is defending the judge, says if the ruling was wrong, it could have been appealed and sent to the Supreme Court. The author concludes that it's wrong to insinuate that a proper act of Judge Berkshire was done because John Bakes was a man of wealth and influence and had a vote, while the lady who was without influence had no vote. Maybe instead of naming this episode The Unfortunate Samuel Gilbert, I should have named this episode The Unfortunate John Bakes. Because 150 years after this article is published, here he is again on the receiving end of insinuations that he used his position of power to take advantage of a lady without influence and without a vote. That concludes this episode. I hope you find the information as interesting as I do. A special thank you to Jason Phelps for helping me find some of these documents. His website is familyhistoryjason, all one word, .wixsite.com, which I'll try to link in this video. In the next episode, we'll get to learn a little bit more about Eliza. And then in episode 7, we find a new record for Alta Rivers, this time in Johnson County, south of Indianapolis. Thank you for watching. See you next time.